I'll just make a couple of prefatory remarks. This was written in 1935, which was kind of when the turn was starting. It's not as more mature work that you get in around 1950, but it's on its way. When I was at University of Chicago, the Heidegger was not taught in the philosophy department, so I would never have had access or to any discussion of this essay in the philosophy department. But in the humanities department, every class that had anything to do with aesthetics or criticism did include this essay. If you got into the general studies and humanities, there was one requirement other than the usual college Common Core requirements, and that was there was a year-long course on aesthetics and criticism that you had to take. There were 15 people in the class. That was, at that time, that was the cap on a class. Nothing could be more than 15 people. And these were the brightest of the brightest. I don't know how I got in that class too, but I was there. And we started out with Aristotle and, his theory of art as, imitation of nature. We did the, through the Ars Poetica. We studied Plato's The Phaedrus, and art and truth through art was the remembrance, the erotic remembrance of before we became people. There was Hume's refinement of aesthetic taste. There was Kant's there was Kant's aesthetics as the formal harmony, the harmony of the categories of understanding. Then we got to something really weird. We got to Nietzsche, and we did the birth of tragedy, and that, this was a bunch of undergraduates who were there looking at a life of academic criticism, and we got to the 20th century, and there were only two things that we studied from the 20th century. One was Benedetto Croce's essay on the nature of art, of which I remember very little, and this essay. And this, out of the 15 people there, I would say maybe 3, at most 5, had any clue what was being talked about in the essay. And the rest were just sort of, what is this? We had been at this point looking at, theories of art and what that means for criticism. Now we've got an essay that seems to be talking much more about being and truth and all these other things than it is art. And even worse for them, it seems to deny any role for a critic. So it was it was quite an experience. It was also taught by a professor named Herman Sinaiko, who was a dyed-in-the-wool Platonist. He also didn't understand the essay and did very little to hide his derision of something that he had no understanding of. But that was then, and even among the brightest of the bright, this essay was inaccessible. I didn't think it was, but a lot of them did. What was your guys' introduction to this essay? How did you come about it?
Well, I think I glanced at it maybe a few years ago, and I think listening to what you were saying, the first thing that occurred to me was, well, he wrote this in the midst of that period when he was writing the Beitrage, right, the contributions to philosophy. So this was right in the heart of his famous turn, the Kara.
I think it was right at the beginning of it. I think the heart of it really was 49 to 53.
So basically 36, 37,
Yeah.
38, around then. Yeah,
Right.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly agree with you that there was further changes in his thinking that took place, from here up through the 40s and 50s. But I guess my point was that this essay was still kind of inaccessible to me, or I didn't appreciate it. I didn't appreciate the value of it fully. I understood it had, with the background of being in time,
Uh-huh.
and some of the other essays from everything that he wrote up through 1928. I had no trouble with because it was all recognizable to me as being part of that era and that
Hmm.
style, right?
Right.
That being in time. But I sort of I underappreciated that change in the language. I thought, oh, it wasn't really until a year ago that um, when I started tackling, there were about four or five, at least they're translated into books into English, mindfulness and not one is metaphysics, another one about metaphysics. But there were four or five of them that all came out between, say, 35 and 41 or 42, including the Black Notebooks, are those two um,
Right.
sections of ponderings that were released between, that concentrated on the period between 1931 and 1939. So all that stuff, I really just bore down and just, kind of immerse myself in all of it and was able to see it differently, to see that there was, first of all, the most important thing was the need for me to understand why it was important for Heidegger to make this change. What exactly was this change in emphasis? What was it about?
Hmm.
Um, and to be honest, I saw less of that change in this essay. Um, in one sense, for example, I think Capo Bianco, I think has been on record as saying that section in Being in Time, the first section where he deals with equipmentality and tool use and all that stuff, says he
Yeah.
never went back to that. He never went back to that,
Well, we did
because
do, but we do have equipment in this.
exactly, and that's why to me it's valuable, because here you see a kind of a bridge that for all those who say there was this radical change in his thinking
It was
between.
a gradual change over about 15 years.
Uh, but this gives me a way to be able to see, to understand the change, or at least the phase of the change that he was in at this point relative to Being in Time. At the same time that you still have a way of being able to incorporate, equipmentality. And I didn't see. Maybe you read it differently, but I didn't necessarily see a contradiction or a significant departure in terms of his treatment of equipmentality with respect, in relation, on the one hand, to President
No,
Handis, or
it was still the four hunting and Sioux hunting. That
yeah,
part of Being in Time remained here. Another thing about the 30s. Um, well, as we go through this, we can talk about some differences from Being in Time. But in the 30s, he was still very much under the sway of Nietzsche. And you see some of that here. Instead of, we've got the form and matter. We've got, where there are some similarities between the conflict of world and earth and Nietzsche's Apollo and Dionysus. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's still that metaphysical um, contrast and in opposition that Nietzsche had. You can see that still kind of coming through. But yeah, it's a transitional time. This essay is early transition. It's not quite like you can see it leading to his more mature works, like what we talked about in the past, the two so far. It's leading to that, but it's not there yet. I wanted to start out with one early passage. I hope you guys can read this. Um, and it says, what art is should be inferable from the work. What the work of art is, we can come to know only from the nature of art. Anyone can easily see that we are moving in a circle. Ordinary understanding demands that this circle be avoided because it violates logic. What art is can be gathered from a comparative examination of actual works. But how are we to be certain that we are indeed basing such an examination on artworks if we do not know beforehand what art is? And the nature of art can be no more arrived at by a derivation from higher concepts than by a collection of characteristics of actual artworks. For such a derivation, too, already has in view the characteristics that must suffice to establish that what we take in advance to be an artwork is one in fact. But selecting works from among given objects and deriving concepts from principles are equally impossible here. And where these procedures are practiced, they are self-deception. Okay, this in that class I had, this alone was driving people insane. Okay, thus we are compelled to follow the circle. This is neither makeshift nor a defect. To enter upon this path is the strength of thought. To continue on it is at the feast of thought, assuming that thinking is a craft. Not only is the main step from work to art a circle like the step from art to work, but every step that we attempt circles in this circle. So we have circles and circles. In order to discover the nature of the art that really prevails in the work, let us go to the actual work and ask the work what and how it is. What's the deal with all those circles? What is he getting at with all the circles?
Well, is he talking about the hermeneutic circle?
Exactly, he is.
Mm-hmm.
This is the hermeneutic circle. Eric, Matilda, are you familiar with the hermeneutic circle? What that is? Okay.
No, I have to tell you, I learned about I actually okay. I first heard about this essay. Yeah, you told me I read it, and then I had a deeper grasp of this essay from my Renaissance art history class. So I got around this essay from like entirely different experience, not from philosophy,
Yep.
from actual examination of works.
Hermeneutics began in early medieval time with Augustine. It was a way of interpreting the Bible, and it assumed that you had to go into the Bible with a belief in the Bible, and then it was a technique of understanding the circles within the circle. That the circle was the Bible in the whole, and then there's all these circles within that circle that you had to delve into and interpret the language. It was basically a means of textual interpretation within the belief in the whole. That's how it started. This essay sort of revived hermeneutics, and it had a huge it had a huge impact on some later thinkers. For Gadamer, this was his touchstone of Heidegger, was this essay, and everything that Gadamer did was in hermeneutics. His was a different sort. It was an interpersonal hermeneutics. Paul Ricoeur, who I knew at Chicago and studied with him, that's all he did. Well, the later Ricoeur was all hermeneutics. He had the hermeneutics of suspicion and hermeneutics of faith. Hermeneutics of suspicion being somebody like Nietzsche, who went through the circle within in order to doubt it and bring it, and lay it bare. And in fact, Josh may already know this, but that was Ricoeur's hermeneutics of suspicion was one of the influences on Derrida, who took it further. The difference between, I talked to Ricoeur about this, who had absolutely no respect for Derrida at all, even though he was referenced by Derrida. But Derrida said there was nothing outside the text. So all we have is interpretation, textual interpretation, and there's no world outside of that. Whereas Ricoeur took more of a Heideggerian approach, that the hermeneutics takes us to the physicality. But it's still with Ricoeur, and the reason he wasn't such an influence on me was it was still textual interpretation. I think with Heidegger, it's think of it as equipment. It's not the work itself. It's some equipment we can use to get at the work. I would also argue that by the late 30s and 40s, I mean, by the late 40s and 50, he was really not working in the hermeneutic manner anymore. He had a different, more poetical, instead of circles within circles, he was looking at layers of meanings of words etymologically, poetically, and the relationship, the entanglement with other words, which is, we're no longer dealing in hermeneutics. This is something entirely new. That's the way I see it. I don't know. What about you guys?
I agree. I think the way I see it, even though without knowing about the circle, I think in some sense he almost talks like an in a way he almost talks like an art historian, like in a sense, it's not about the textual analysis of the art itself, because the textual analysis of art itself would be from like the surface, like the color or the shape or the
Right.
composition, just take the
Exactly.
surface, right? But the thing is, I think it's about the way I say he talks about like art historian is, this is about going into the symbolism, the allegorical meaning of art, like going into that direction of what it actually reveals.
Right. The hermeneutic circle isn't within the text. It's the text takes us to where the hermeneutic circles are. And it's the hermeneutic circles of world. We can't know of world without earth. We can't know of truth without art. We can't know art without truth. And then, I mean, the biggest circle of all is the very use of Ursprung, or the origin. In German, origin is Ursprung, and it means the primordial springing up. And we start out with the origin of the Ursprung of the work of art. At that point, what we're looking at, okay, well, what does art come from? What is that originating spring out of the earth that makes art? And we end up with Ursprung des Kunstwerkes as the originating of art, of truth. So Ursprung is itself a circle. We have the Ursprung of art and the Ursprung of that art creates. So it's that is the whole right there, all around the word Ursprung.
I wanted to, because I do think it's relevant here, and because I do think that I happen to think that Derrida is the best interpreter of Heidegger, and that he's much closer to Heidegger's work than many others might tend to think. So, in that regard, I wanted to take up this notion that by text, Derrida literally means words on a piece of paper. And I would say that that's not at all what Derrida means. By text, he means context. There is nothing outside of context. And by that, he means there is nothing but continual recontextualizations of context. He's not talking about words on a page. He's talking about the world. And he says so. He says the phrase for some has become a sort of slogan in general, so badly misunderstood of deconstruction that there is nothing outside the text means nothing else. There is nothing outside context. In this form, which says exactly the same thing, the formula would doubtless have been less shocking. But anyway, so this way of thinking context does not as such amount to a relativism with everything that is sometimes associated with it. First of all, because as Husserl has shown, well, let me just skip. This way of thinking context is neither a philosophical position or, okay. To the extent to which, by virtue of its socio-institutional situation, its language, the historical inscription of its gestures, is itself rooted in a given context. He says, okay, so in a few moments ago, I insisted on writing, at least in quotation mark, the strange and trivial formula, real history of the world, in order to mark clearly that the concept of text or context which guides me embraces and does not exclude the world, reality, and history. Once again, and this probably makes 1,000 times I've had to repeat this, but when will it finally be heard and why this resistance? As I understand it, and I have explained why, the text is not the book. It is not confined in the volume itself, confined to the library. It does not suspend reference to history, to the world, to reality, to being, especially not to the other. Since to say of history, of the world, of reality, that they always already appeared in an experience, hence in a movement of interpretation which contextualizes them according to a network of differences and hence of referral to the other, is surely to recall that alterity and difference is irreducible. That, so,
I wonder. I wonder why didn't you just say? I mean, I don't really know Derrida that well, but why didn't you say that there's nothing outside the context? That would seem to avoid it. Does it be provocative, maybe, or because that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of a challenge to Platonism, right? Getting out of the cave, ultimate truth, reality, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Seems like maybe there's shock value there, like kind of a playfulness or something, right?
Yeah.
I get it, but you can't be upset when
but
people.
it was also really a denial of being as a real thing. Could I give a slightly different perspective on what Derrida means by what you went through, Josh? He doesn't necessarily mean the text. He doesn't limit it to. Who did we lose? Oh, we lost. Okay. He doesn't limit it to just text on the page. He limits it to language, langue and parole. But in context is really, I mean, everything becomes just simply, everything is the text of language, the text of gesture. And that's how we know that's what the world consists of. And it generates and connects with other text, but there's nothing outside of the text, which is the opposite of Heidegger. For Heidegger, the real truth is what gets disclosed out of what is closed off to us, and that's being. There is a real ground. The difference is in ground. For Derrida, there is no ground. You can't get out of the language, the verbal context to get to a ground. And that's why you go to deconstruction. What you're basically doing is looking at every system of thought and deconstructing it and showing where it has its contradictions. But there's never an appeal to ground. To me, I always saw it as the most extreme of metaphysics.
Lee Braver wrote a book in which he compared Heidegger and Wittgenstein, and there was another one which he also threw in Nietzsche and Foucault. And he said what they all had in common, well, particularly Heidegger and Wittgenstein, was he titled the book "Groundless Grounds," indicating that for both Wittgenstein and Nietzsche and Heidegger, that as well as for Derrida, that the ground is groundless in the sense that the ground is in the is the becoming itself. It's the event in process, rather than something that can be rooted in something which itself is not subject to contextual relations to say to language and anyways. I mean, so that's just one interpretation, but there are many who go in that direction in terms of seeing that for Heidegger as well as for Derrida, maybe certainly in different ways, he's not positing some sort of a ground that can survive or protect itself from contextual transformation. And since we are, you can't have being without us. I mean, we are not being, but you can't have being without the human being. That means that you can't do without language in terms of, I mean, as far as I can imagine, I don't know. I mean, what survives of being without language?
What survives is the initial contact.
What about the experience? What about the experience? Could you have the experience, for example, of anxiety without having the language to describe it, or something, or something, some fundamental?
Yes, there's
primordial
he
phenomena-
talks about the
phenomena, like-
unspeakable. There is the unspeakable, and Wittgenstein
Right.
and Heidegger both speak of that. But let me go back to the groundless ground. That would be the exact opposite of what we see in this particular essay and throughout Heidegger. That's a difference between Derrida and Heidegger. Is Derrida did think the ground was groundless. Heidegger says it's that slab of mud in front of you, it's that stone in front of you, and it is self-protecting. He uses those words in this essay. The ground is the earth, and the earth is self-protecting. It moves in on itself and conceals itself. But that is the ground, and on that ground we can throw that ground up into a thing and down in down from the heavens, and then what we have is a world that's worlding. That world is a playing out of the opposition it's the world is that opposition of the striving, our will to knowledge. I mean, that's the other Nietzschean thing. Will to power becomes will to truth, and our will to truth butting up against this self-enclosing ground is where truth takes place within a world. But if we don't have, if we lose sight of that ground, we become groundless metaphysics. And this is in advance of his, what we saw in the late 40s and early 50s, his Grund, from which we have the Sprung, we have the ground, and the springing up from the ground. We have the Abgrund, which is nihilism without any grounds. It's looking down there, but the ground is kind of unknowable. It's unfathomable. And then we have the Ungrund of metaphysics, and that's why I consider Derrida the most extreme of the metaphysicians, in that he totally discounts ground. It's an Ungrund. We can't get to it. All we have is our language, our text, our context. And there is nothing outside of that which means there is no real ground.
Wouldn't that?
I kind of want to circle back a little bit on the metaphysics thing, because I don't think there is metaphysics in this essay, because I think Heidegger was trying to say, or he wants to illustrate this thing about how truth is being revealed through this sort of visual language, because this is how representation is formed, through a visual language, which is art. And when this visual language is formed a representation, and hence truth is revealed. So it's like a step by step. I think he later talks about kind of the language of allegory and symbol, and they provide this conceptual frame within the channel of the vision of the artwork. and how they are characterized. I think he was really just trying to provide you like this sort of like a circle back, this sort of like a this mind map about eventually you will get there, like how truth is revealed. And in this case, in this essay, truth is revealed through art, but how art is formed through this visual language, but visual language forms representation, even though not every piece of art can form a representation, because not every piece of art has allegory or symbolism. But I think
Well,
he's
yeah,
talking
I
about.
think that be careful with the allegory and symbolism,
Mhm.
because that was just one of the steps he was going through. He didn't at the end say it's allegory and symbolism. That was one of the circles we had to get through to get to what the work really
Oh
is.
yeah, I think that that's the case of that's like the case for painting, but the allegory or symbolism, I don't think that case suits for music. I think for music, it's a very completely different case. Yeah.
Well,
Um,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
it might, might be helpful, I think, to if we were to go over the distinctions that Heidegger makes here, because I think they're
Yes.
key to what we're talking about between um, the older traditional metaphysical notion of the thing, going back to, was it
Hmm.
Aristotle, with the distinction between matter and form,
Right.
uh, and the distinction between what is present or present at hand and what is equipmental, and what is a work, right? So for
Right.
Heidegger, right, he connects his notion of the thing to the work. So how is the work different, on the one hand, from the notion of the thing as
Right.
as formed matter, and that of equipmentality? Now he does say that you can't, equipmentality, right? What would be the ready to hand and being in
Hmm.
time, is right. That's the human being has to make, right. We form what it is that we make, whether it's a tool or whatever, out of the matter. So you have the matter, and then you get the separation between the matter and then the forming process, the ordering that we accomplish, right. So. But then so my interpretation of the work, the distinction between his notion of the work, and that notion of the thing, or the thingliness of the thing that he's
Hmm.
getting at in the work,
Right.
and the traditional one as formed matter, is the is that what forms itself is not something that is uh, controlled by the artist, by the person making it.
Right.
We don't have a scheme, and then I mean, right. So we're not forming something which is matter, whereas it's emerging out of, right. It's not, it's not due to the genius of the creator, and but neither is it simply something that is already, how do I put that, I mean, it's not already there in the object either. So it's this process of creation, which requires us, we have to be there for it, but it's
Right.
not, right, it's not due to, it's not controlled by us. Yeah.
Keep
So
going. I will be right back. Give me just a second.
okay. um Anyway, so yeah, so to me, that notion of the thing that he's getting at, it isn't it's very different than what we think of when we think of something. We pick up a rock, right? And the rock is this object. It has properties and it has attributes, right? Or we could pick up a hammer, and then we say, well, no, that's a tool. We understand the hammer on the basis of what we're going to use it for. So in one case, you've got this thing which is just has its present, it's just there in and of itself, and already has its its characteristics, right? And then on the second case, you've got this tool which is what it is based on our use of it. But I think for Heidegger, those are both inadequate understandings of what of our relationship to the world, because what they're missing is that whenever you are experience something in front of you, you're not just staring at it on the one hand, and you're not just controlling it because you've got a use for it. Yes, you may pick up the hammer and use it, but there's going to, and this is where context comes into play. There's something fresh and new and immediate and now about the event of your relating to it. There's something new that's coming into play that isn't taken care of by the fact that, on the one hand, you've got, oh, this thing in front of me, I already know what it is. It's got, I can describe its features, right? And on the other hand, it's not, you haven't fully grasped your relationship to anything that you're dealing with on the basis of, what you already know about why it's useful to you. All those things are sort of canned knowledge, right? They're relying
Right.
on, what you know from your past experience with these things, but they both miss the immediate contextual relation with it. And I think that's what so work of art is, wow, this experience of sculpting something isn't just, okay, I'm going to manufacture this thing, right? It's what takes place, right? As the artwork is this sort of this, creative process, which sort of, is the sort of this in between, right? It's in between me and the lump of clay or whatever. It's not me dominating the lump of clay or the lump of clay dominating me. It's this magical, novelty which emerges out of this interaction. Anyway, that's sort of the way
I'd say even within my understanding, and I'm not really saying much because I'm totally out of my element here, but even within artworks, right? Heidegger has a hierarchy. He mentioned specifically he's only referring to certain types of art, right?
He
if a
says
sculptor is
specifically
motivated
only
by
great art.
right, a potential consumer, and he's kind of adapting it to that. That's not like, activating the strife between earth and world. That's he has specific types of art in mind, right?
To him, to Heidegger, there was great art, which is this work in the disclosedness of truth,
Right.
and then there was all this other stuff that's sometimes called art.
But it's still not the ready to hand or the president hand. It occupies some ambiguous ground, right?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes the world of art business. It becomes the world of criticism. But in doing so, we lose sight of the actual work of art. Can I make a couple? I just want to make a couple comments. I gotta let them out. Josh mentioned two things: context and creation, both of which we need to take a step back on. Let's start with context. You cannot apply Derrida's context to Heidegger's context. Well, in fact, Heidegger doesn't ever really use that word. He uses relation, but context for Derrida means a historical context of all the things that were thought and the language and the parole and all the memes coming together. That's context for Derrida. That's not for Heidegger. He says explicitly when we experience art in a preservative way as the preservers of the truth, what we look at is something that has no context of that sort. We cannot bring our metaphysics in prior knowledge to bear on it. This is a new and entirely different thing. And we can only understand, if we're going to talk about context, it's in context of that world, that particular world that is being lit up by the artwork, but not by anything outside of that world. So
I could go with that. Yeah. Well, why don't we sort of okay, so we can leave sort of Derrida behind, but what if we bring into play, like Dreyfus, right? How Dreyfus's reading of Heidegger, that became a key basis for a lot of his work. I mean, what machines can't do and all that. This whole notion of skilled, unreflective, skilled coping. So I think that's really what I want to capture in terms of what I'm the kind of understanding I'm getting from this this
okay.
essay, right?
Yeah.
So. Yeah. So in other words, the actual immediate interaction with something, which is this give and take, which is always in the now, which is unfolding new aspects of itself right in front of you, right? And that you're adapting yourself to, rather than consulting some canned bits of knowledge that you're simply applying.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And let me put this up. That's the painting.
Can you talk a little bit more about the context issue you guys are going back and forth on? Because when I think of, like, for example, like I'm better at thinking in concrete terms, right? So the Greek temple or whatever, right? It emerges into the context of the gods, right, which are already laid out. But Heidegger seems to say that it creates the context, right?
Yes.
It doesn't respond. It's not the product of a context that can be studied by historians or art historians or whatever. It creates the context. It kind of it's
the work of art creates the lighted space.
So that would be contrary to what Derrida is saying, right? There's nothing outside. There's this mysterious source. Opposite. Okay, just trying to get a foothold on the conversation here.
I've been arguing with Derridians since the 70s.
Yeah. No, but really, what I wanted to capture, this notion of an unfolding, and I don't even want to use the word context anymore, because that it's too easy to, to kind of get bogged down or confused by it. But no, the unfolding of the textures of the experience that sort of that produces this give and take in front of you, that doesn't require the consulting of intellectualized or rationalized information. It's simply a knowing, or okay, I'll use the word context, knowing what to do in context, right? So again, but this is, you have to think of it in terms of something which is unfolding and changing and flowing, rather than something which is just some static frame that you're stuck within. Right?
It's certainly not a static frame. It's something. It's an event. It's not an object. It's an event, and it's an event of, in Heidegger's terms, the event is that opposition in repose of world and earth. Being is in both. Okay, being is not just the earth that closes itself off from us. Because being also is what works through us to show individual things. We should go back to just briefly, the difference between objects and things. He talked about the early Greek thing as a substance and accidents, and we reject that. Then he talks about the Kantian thing as the thing in itself, which is pure noumenal. Outside of our representations, we can't know that. But Heidegger thinks of thing entirely differently. It is that interplay of it's when the world comes thrust down onto the mud of the earth, and from that the earth thrusts up in a thing. Now, and that's what we should look at maybe next is Das Ding, where he talks about a thing. And what a thing is there is, again, it's an event. A thing is an event. It's a gathering. It's a gathering of manifold flux of being. Being is a manifold, and a thing is when things gather together to form something. And he goes back to the original Germanic meaning of thing, which is a gathering. And he talks about, in the Scandinavian countries, they still have the outing, which is their Congress. It is the gathering of all. A thing is a gathering. And that's what a gathering really is. To me, because I've got my physics perspective on top of everything else, it's the same thing as what we see when an entity emerges from quantum fields. It's a gathering of quantum fields and vibrations, which can self-organize into a thing. And that's what's at work in the thingness of a work of art, is that repose of the opposition of the thrusting down of the world and the thrusting up of earth. What the world is being's will to truth. And he talks in this essay of truth having its own will. And that's works through us because we're a part of being also. And it looks down, and it simultaneously, the earth conceals, it discloses just a bit of itself. And what we have then is sort of, Eric, what Richard calls the shimmering, which we see there. What we have is suddenly something appears and we see its world. We don't look at it and say, like Aristotle, okay, that's a proper imitation of nature. It's no such thing. It's certainly not Kant's harmonious forms. It's not even Hume's refined taste. What it is a shimmering around the world of that peasant woman. And what we see in it is the strife, the long toiling that she had to do, the stomping through the fields and the paths. All of that is the interplay of the will to overcome, to survive, to know, and the hardness of the earth that always opposes it. It opposes it as limiting. It delimits the world. You can't go beyond that. The earth is the limiting factor. It also is what makes things difficult. It's what makes things sometimes evasive, not tricking, difficult to actually ascertain, maybe even fool you. It's that conflict that plays out there, but we see it in the painting. It has no context really. It's just a shimmering around it that shows the wear. I mean, the boots themselves are equipment, and what equipment does is loses itself in its usability, and it's ephemeral. But we're not looking. I mean, but the work of art is not equipment. What the work of art is a type of thing that makes something, it makes an event happen before us and highlights it with the shimmering.
I wonder, do you believe that you like the sensibilities that Heidegger had to being, to language, to art, whatever it is, right? Is that something you can learn, or is it something you just have naturally, right? Because I think the average person would look at that, even someone who's not versed, maybe especially someone who's not versed in these kind of conceptual frameworks like matter, form, substance, accident, would look at that and see a pair of like shoes, right?
Exactly right.
Very sophisticated analysis that Heidegger gives. I don't think the average is capable of really bringing all this to light, right? Like,
well,
I think
I'm
it's
sorry, Matilda. Go
I
ahead.
think it's 60-40. So like the ability to appreciate art like Van Gogh, that one it can be trained, but like a deeper understanding of things, like the immediate like intuition of when you see like a painting and you actually feel about it and how good it is, that sort of intuition, it links to like a person's ability to feel about art or kind of appreciate like how good it is. That kind of like it links to like judgment of art. Like for example, some curators or some art dealers, when they see something, they can say, oh, this is actually good. They are able to pick something that is not like already very expensive or famous and made them very famous. I think that links to intuition, but the thing you're talking about, that type of sort of appreciation and ability, I think is trained. So I think it's actually 60-40. So like 60% is like very trainable, like anybody. I think he's very trainable, but the rest of 40%, I think it depends on the other person's sort of like conceived talent or something.
And there's also a lot of there also seems to be a lot of contextual knowledge required to really appreciate these shoes, right?
Well,
Like if you're like an urban intellectual living in the 21st century, right? That world is totally, I don't say totally, but almost totally closed off to you.
Right.
So,
that's why you'll never really inhabit the world of that temple he was talking about.
Right.
And
you can recognize
becomes
another world. You can appreciate. Right.
You can an artwork.
You can appreciate the technical mastery, but you can appreciate like the technical mastery. You know, like you can maybe see that it's from a different world, right? So in some sense, it does bring in that, but yeah.
Are you inhabiting that world? Or are you inhabiting the world that you are experiencing when you have your particular experience of looking at that? It doesn't have to be. It's not a world which is sitting out there and has already been tabulated somewhere, and then we have to consult each other to see if we're seeing the correct world that was being depicted or not. I don't think that's the point.
Oh no, that's Heidegger has answered all of these things in the essay. Let me just point out a few things.
But I do think you don't have to be physically in the 1920s in this case. I think you just need to see like the piece like in person. Because I just remember, because we used his essay when we were discussing Titian's Ecce Homo. Because like I just remember like my professor was like, "Oh, Ecce Homo is so great because Ecce Homo kind of like Titian painted on the stone, and according to Heidegger, it is actually the representation revealed like Jesus Christ sacrificed himself or something." Well, I'm not Catholic, I don't know about that part, but I do get about the representation revealed some truths for Christians. I got that part about the representation to reveal. I got that logic. And then I was looking at the painting on the screen and I thought, I would probably understand how significant this is if I see this in person, but I really do not get it because I cannot see all the shimmering, whatever they're talking about on the screen from here, like the detail, whatever. Yeah.
Let me say a couple of things here. First of all, on can you learn to do this? Heidegger's talked about how you can and how you can't. You will not ever enter the painting of the shoes by studying art history, Van Gogh's life, different art techniques, things like that, things that you're taught in art history. You will never enter the painting that way. What you have to do is you have to become a philosopher, not a critic. And that's what drove everybody in my class nuts, because they were all just suddenly disqualified. You have to open up to the work as a work, not as a representation. Matilda said representation. Representation is not what's happening here. It's an event of the disclosedness of truth. Actually, in a way, the less you know about art theory, the easier time you're going to have entering into the work itself. Now, we talked about, well, the world of the Greek temple is gone. In a way it is, in a way it isn't. And that gets later on when he's talking about art and truth. And what is truth? Well, it's not correspondence theory, that's for sure. Truth is an event in itself. It is the opening up of that world, the conflict between world and the self, the closing up of earth, but reposed on the earth, and that's a philosophical. You need to understand the poetic philosophical thinking, how to do that to enter into the world. Can most people do that? No.
I really don't know if you actually need to know about philosophy to enter like this realm of the painting, but I do think like you need like a level of sorts of, I think the word I'm looking for is like called intertextuality, but it's not like a technical way. It's a ability to connect everything together when you're in front of a painting. I remember there's one scene when I was looking at Juan Miro's this surrealist painting. It's all dots and the stripes. And when I was looking at it in front of it, I felt like myself was in it because it turned into poetry in my head. Like all the lines, they started moving in my head. It turned into poetry, and I just started thinking. And then later, at some point, I feel like it's like music. So I just feel like it's
Right,
like
yeah, I
think,
agree. You don't
yeah,
need
you know.
philosophy, especially if you're a poet or a musician or an artist, because you will, if you are a real, authentic artist, it's something that you will do
Yeah, but just
What
automatically. It's
but
what
I
you
do,
what
do.
but I do think this ability of intertextuality at some point it can be trained for some people, but but still I'm not sure if it's trainable for everyone.
Yeah, and I would object to the textual part of it because a
Mm-hmm.
text is an object. When we talk about text, we've turned the work into an object.
I'm not sure.
and remember
Intermediate
yeah.
or intertextuality, I forgot. What's the word?
I remember we're talking about the truth. His aim is ascertaining the truth of being here. In that context, I have a question here. What's the difference between being accessing the truth of being through looking at, say, the painting of Van Gogh's shoes, and looking at a baseball that's sitting in front of you? Now you're not looking. Now I'm not talking about looking at something within the context of deliberately thinking of it
That's
in
a great
terms of a
example.
work of art. I'm talking about just, I mean, so just the experience of looking at an object in front of you. Well,
But that's what I'm talking about, though. That's a good example because let's say someone presented Heidegger with a picture of a bat and a ball, right, in a glove. He wouldn't make the associations he's making. This world was kind of part of his world, right? Late 19th century, born
This was
agrarian
yeah,
definitely a
well,
part of
well,
his world.
yeah, no, but
to him in a way that's not maybe for me as a suburban Los Angeles kid growing up playing baseball.
yeah, but
Can I answer that real quick?
I'm sorry.
He makes a
No.
distinction between things already disclosed, which become objects, and we can talk about their correctness, but we recognize them right away as objects, not as something strange. The work of art takes the context out of it so that we see it in itself, not in its commonality, not in its fallenness, but in its own strange way. So if you had a baseball in front of you, if you were an artist, you might be able to do away with the commonplace, find the strangeness, and bring that about as a work. But just a baseball in front of you is going to always just be a commonplace object,
Why?
and that's the
I thought
difference
I thought
between.
about that. Incidentally, like different modes of being, right? You have in being in time, you have the present at hand, the ready to hand, and
Right.
right? And then
And that's his play here. He's still in this essay. He is still on the ready to hand, the 200 and
yeah, I
400.
disagree with Capobianco on that. It's almost like he presents it and then he assimilates it into his larger mood, right? He never talks because it's kind of like dealt with. It seems like.
No,
This time of
I
year.
don't.
But what about like playfulness, right? Playfulness of an object, like a baseball. That's not
Yeah.
really. I guess you could say it's ready to hand if you work that schema, right?
Yes,
Where would that fit in, right?
but
A child's play, right?
in the
Heraclitus,
play, it's
a way of
equipment for
being.
play. It's sports equipment. It's equipment. It's not a thing.
Okay.
That still is a thing. I mean
Well, yeah, I mean,
that's still the inauthentic or the notion of the thing that he's critiquing in
yeah,
this essay. When you look at it as a piece of
but
equipment, or if you look at
it's
it as a
not
person to hand
perceived as a
object, and that
thing.
was my point about a baseball. Never mind the fact that it's not a work of art. He would argue that just looking at anything in those terms is missing something about that. You're not seeing the truth of that object.
Well, that's
The truth of
true.
being through it.
But we're talking about and that's why I said if the baseball was just in front of you, and you just baseball player or anybody else. It's a piece of it's an object, not a thing. It's a commonplace piece of equipment, and you don't see the thingness of it at all. And I'm not saying the thingness isn't there, but it's not perceived. We
It's not
take it.
perceived, right? So
We
that's
take it as
that's
a
a failing,
commonplace
right?
object.
That's a limitation, right?
I'm sorry.
That's a failing or a limitation. What are the words he uses? It's a flattening, it's a concealing, it's a forgetting, right?
It's a
So
forgetting. It's a forgetting.
it's a forgetting, yeah.
Yeah, Seinsvergessenheit, the forgetting of being. And that's what permeates the everyday. And that's especially what comes to the fore today in the time of Gestalt. Everything is flattened into just the total Seinsvergessenheit. Being has turned its back to us in Gestalt.
He's
But
kind of intimating that scenario
have that
here.
idea here in 35. That doesn't
A
come
little
until
bit.
around.
A little bit,
What?
don't you think? All these conceptual frameworks crowding in, blocking access, the dissembling of being, right?
Yeah.
He has it in his sights, but it's not fully like,
No. Let me rephrase it. The Earth always closes itself off, and just closes bits of it a little at a time, and gives hints. That shimmering is the hint of all the mystery behind it. But what we are now is we don't see the shimmering anymore. Gestalt is the radical end of it, where everything is disclosed. But what the difference now is being itself has turned its back. The Earth always has, but being itself in Gestalt, in Die Kehre, the turning, he talks to that about the being is also in. I mean, he has his turn, but being has its turn also, and has turned away from man and left us in the deepest despair. But in that despair, we can always see that even in Gestalt, it's all a way of disclosedness. It's just an extremely reductive, soulless disclosedness, and maybe we will recognize our plight in that poverty of disclosedness. It's the difference between the disclosedness in the picture of the boots and disclosedness as collapse of the wave function.
Oh, that's interesting.
one wonders if Heidegger was kind of caught in the snares of the framing in Being in Time, because when I think about it, even everything shows itself primarily as like resource, right? Like the rock
Gestalt, everything
right?
is
The mountains, rock quarry,
even people.
the woods are potential lumber, right?
Yeah,
the ready to hand was
that's all that exists, including people.
So this is a big shift. Artworks is kind of a different way of disclosing it, right?
But that was just the first section of Being in Time. The second section, he moves into why that's an inauthentic disclosure, right?
Yes, he does.
Yeah.
What was the authentic? Refresh my memory, though. There was no authentic disclosure in terms of like releasement from this situation, right? Where
Yeah, there was. He said it was ontic. Yeah, he said equipmentality is ontic, but it's not ontological.
Exactly right.
Yeah,
he does. I think one of the
there's no other alternative. Like there's no other possibility, at least that I'm aware of, in Being in Time, at least in the 1927.
Everything in the first, everything that you're talking about in the first section is in order to. Everything that we use is in order to achieve our goals. Well, but it's not for. But it's the second section is about for the sake of which.
I get it, and there's intimations of an authentic mode of being, but there's no content to those. It's just
he had no way of doing that in Being in Time, and in the turn, the underlying thing in the turn is the rejection of the subject-object metaphysics that was in Being in Time, because it's implicit in phenomenology, and Heidegger was consciously writing a piece of phenomenology in Being in Time. And so we only could see things from the subjective. Phenomenology is how do you subjectively know the world? And that's what Heidegger was doing. He was doing it, he was trying to understand from inside the subject against the other of what's outside of him as being, and how do you grasp? That's what he's right here. He's starting to make that turn. By the
Right.
time you get to 49 or 50, it's completely gone. There is no difference. I mean, we are part of being. There is we're not a subject that's looking at this other thing called being. We are being, and being
Right.
speaks through us authentically.
But
Right,
wasn't
but
that
in
already in
being
being in time?
No,
I mean,
it's not.
the subject
Yeah.
comes back to itself from the world. That's the point of anxiety, and that's what
Yeah,
later
but-
becomes the plight of being, and the strife. The strife is anxiety, and he already
Oh, yeah.
introduces that in being in time.
But the
The
anxiety,
anxiety is a result of the kind of the situation you're in, right? Just thrown, your facticity, the best you can achieve. I agree with Calvin is kind of a stoic resoluteness in the face of death, right? With really no, it's
but
there's a
the
later
anxiety was
some
also
in there, it seems like, and voluntarism, whatever it's called.
because being was all completely other than your subject. It wasn't the thing of, yeah, you come back to your own subjectivity, but you have to, because that's all you have in being in time. It's all written from the point of your subjectivity.
The subject
Here-
doesn't exist before projection, and the projection is from the other, is from beyond it. There is no subject before projection. There is no extant subject sitting there waiting to be affected in being in time.
But what happens in the later Heidegger, and we even see it here. Projection is something different. Projection is our projection of possibility, of the light. It's trying to, because being shines through us. Okay, that's where the light comes from, and we project that, and that's space and time is created that way. There is no space and time other than through our projection. But we can't think of projection the way a psychologist thinks of projection. Projection is projecting out a lighted space time in which a world can inhabit and world. And
Yeah.
now in
This is
being
what wait, isn't this is basically what he said in the poem?
yeah,
But yeah, to be old means to stop in time.
um,
I'm racking my memory here, but the projection of being. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, but I think it's very interesting. Like on a side note, I think whatever being and art and whatever the relationship is, I do think he kind of illustrate that just very simply in that poem. Just very in a very straightforward way, actually.
The other thing I wanted to come back to that I never got to was when Josh brought up creation, because we need to carefully think what Heidegger is thinking by creation. And it can be slippery for a while. But first thing to consider is the German word for creation is Erschöpfung. And it's cognate with our shape, and it isn't really when he's talking about creation, he's talking about shaping. He's not talking about suddenly out of just making ex nihilo a creation. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about there's the earth, and we don't create in that sense. Our creation it's not creation, it's shaping, and it's taking that mud and shaping it, but it's not. There's the difference between the way we shape the work of art and a piece of equipment is when we shape a piece of equipment, it's for a particular practical use in our world. And we have an intention, we have an idea of what we want it to do, and it's all determined by its purpose. A work of art is essentially different because the shaping isn't our willful design. He's a great pains to say it denies the name of the artist. It's being. It's because we're also part of being. We're that conscious part of being. It's the being working through us to form something, to shape something. And that's what creation is. And truth, we got to get the truth also, because that ends up being the key piece of this thing. Truth is not correspondence. It's not getting the facts correct. Truth is the openness to the strange beingness of the world. And he uses, truth in German is Wahrheit. And that's where this preservation comes from, because Wahr, I talked about this last time, but in German, Wahren means to preserve, to protect, to cover, to let be in the way it is. And so Wahrheit it's temporal. It doesn't need to be eternal. And the truth in the work of art exists as Wahrheit as long as somebody is doing the Wahren, the preserving of that light on the world of being. So we need to, when we talk about creation or truth in a work of art with Heidegger, it needs to be thought in that very special way, not in the commonplace way. But I said it's nuanced before, because we still have the creation out of nothing, but nothing takes on a wholly different meaning also. It doesn't mean that there isn't existence. It means there's nothing in that existence that's yet a thing. A thing happens when it pushes up into the world.
This is also continuous with being in time, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so we're kind of making connections here, where truth, propositional truth, is derivative of the more primordial truth of openness, of disclosive.
Yes,
right?
that's right.
That
Yeah,
really
that
doesn't change
doesn't
either. Maybe there's more of a kind of a moving toward of a kind of receptivity, a givenness. You could say, to generalize, a more kind of a female or kind of understanding of these polarities or whatever, receptivity rather than a projecting, right?
Yes, yeah.
Even there, it's not the late releasement and total receptivity. There's still some room for the kind of the agency of the artist or whatever.
There is, as long as
it's the vehicle of being or whatever
is willed through through being, the truth of being, and not our practical intentions. But there's still no, the key here, and this is the key break with being in time, is there's no subject object duality. There's no split. Being and we are the same thing. We're an instance of it and a reductive instance of it, but we are also that part that can create a world. There's no world without us. There's just
so deeply, it's that way of thinking is so deeply ingrained in at least the English language, right? It's common sense, right? This kind of dualism in the language is really brings to the fore like how difficult it is to think with Heidegger in a language this word. Like even when you mentioned like thing earlier, like in English, there's no resonance of like what you were talking about, right? It's
none
just
at all. None.
The mere thing, like Heidegger said. There's not that kind of more elevated understanding of a thing at all. So it's almost like you have to kind of like, what's the term? Put new
but
line
you know what? We could go back to it.
Create a new language.
Get to it if we thought poetically, because thing, ding, they're the same word. They're the same Germanic root, and we are at basic Germanic language with a whole lot of French influence. We could do what Heidegger did in English and it's going to take more layers of excavation to get there, but we could do it.
So what did he do to English? Anyway, that's a side question, but I think, but anyway, I do think it's very interesting that he said that poetry needs to depart from being that to reach the truth. And I was actually thinking that if poetry is like a device for you to reach the truth, or is also kind of like a essence, a part of the truth, but you also need to write it to see the truth. It's like, it's a part of being, but you need to separate poetry from being to reach, like to let it reach to the truth.
No, by depart, he means it departs from. It's the station it leaves out of.
No, but his original, they grew out of being and reach into its truth. But basically, if they grew out of being, basically they depart from being and reach.
Yeah, but he doesn't mean that you disconnect from being. He means that that is the starting point from which you depart, but you don't break the connection. We are being. We couldn't possibly do that. I mean, we can forget being. We can reduce our awareness to mere objects, but we're still being, and Gestalt is still being also.
But do you see this correlation between poetry and the truth?
Well,
He just
poetry,
doesn't say language anymore, it's just poetry.
yeah, and
Because when
he
it
uses
comes to poetry, you
poetry.
have to have
Yeah,
language.
I mean, he talks about poetry and music, poetry and art. Um, but he goes back to, remember in our first essay where there was physis and poesy, and that's really what he means by this is poesy, which is the bringing forth into the light something new in its strangeness.
What is there a point where it is no longer strange?
Yeah, that's the fallen everyday world of objects in science.
But that's forgetting, right?
Yes,
All right.
Seinsvergessenheit gets us. It blocks off the strange and makes everything kind of flatten and familiar.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking you is, um, for example, you were bringing into play, quantum physics there. So there within quantum physics, hold on a second. There is the strange and there is the familiar. Um,
Well, actually, my interest in quantum physics is the strange.
okay, the, the strange, or if you want to call it the unpredictable, within is there, right, within physics. But then there's also structural laws, right? There's also there's that which can be I don't want to say that which can be quantified, but there's a certain stability there that one can refer back to, and the strangeness is couched within. Otherwise, it wouldn't be science. What makes it science is that you're dealing with aspects which are objective, or to put it differently, you're dealing with a notion of the real, and the real implies that there's a certain persistence of some, if not persistence of objects, there's persistence of structures or of processes or of forms within the physics. And so that is that's the non-strange, which allows physics, or today's physics, to do what it does and to make the assumptions that it makes in order to do what it does. So I guess I'm to try and relate that back to what would be the equivalent of that. I mean, would you then say that, all right, those aspects of quantum physics that deal with what is stable and structural and formal, is that a form of forgetting?
Yes, it is, but you bring up a more interesting point than that. Um, the thing about modern physics is it brought itself to a crisis because what appears to be laws of, physical laws of the universe start to become tenuous the more fundamentally you look at what exists. And what we think of as laws seems to be more just a temporary steadiness of certain relations in a subsystem. And the closer you get to, the quantum itself is weird. I mean, that's actually a term in physics, the weirdness of quantum physics.
Sure.
And in one physicist said, it quantum physics, the quantum realm isn't just weird, it's weirder than you can possibly imagine. It's beyond our very reductive capacity to interpret the world. And it's the closer you get to the bottom. I mean, just what the lowest that we can. We can't get behind the density matrices to get to the real quantum state. We can't do that. We can't begin to grasp what that is. The lowest we can get is quantum fields, but already in quantum fields, things like causality and logic have no application. They don't. It's a totally chaotic universe at that point, and there are no entities. I mean, Leggett showed that. Bell showed that, that there is no locality, and Leggett showed that there's also no realism. It's not real in the way it's defined in physics doesn't exist fundamentally. That's something that emerges, and the question really is, what is this emergence? Is it something really physical? Is it something that we reduce in our minds? And we just simplify until something looks like an entity to us, but it's really this incomprehensibly complex interplay of things, and we only focus on a small part to look like an entity. Is it that? Is it some combination of that? How does conscious play into it? That's the stuff that physics absolutely fails to answer, because it can't. Those can't be. I mean, the classical approach to physics, and especially the mathematical approach to physics, can't possibly penetrate that. All it can do is tell us what we see on our side of the wave collapse. And even there, it can only tell us as probabilities. It can't tell us what is going to happen. It's not deterministic. And it sure can't say why it's happening that way. And that's what attracts me.
Brings up a good, I thought often about this, about different kind of different ways, because I feel that is a presupposition of really getting Heidegger to feel that strangeness of existence, right?
Yes, that's the whole point.
Like of the authenticity or whatever of the philosopher, or there are different ways in being in time. We've talked about before, Jeffrey, like anxiety. The function is to dislodge you from that complacent everydayness,
yes.
Right? But if a physicist can study this stuff and likewise kind of feel the strangeness of things, right? Or maybe a work of art can take you out of that complacent everyday.
For some of the really great physicists, in fact, it does that. And I would say that's not 99% of physicists. Most physicists are in open rebellion against reality. They want to maintain the fiction of an orderly, explicable, deterministic universe. Despite all evidence against them, that's what they want to do. But then you get the daring ones who.
Well, that's what I talked about earlier, kind of vis-a-vis art. Like, can you teach someone that, right? Or is it something that comes natural? Some people are just gonna, for whatever reason, right?
I think it's partly temperament. I think it is partly temperament. And if you're of the right temperament, you can learn to open yourself up to experience.
If you're like a Wittgenstein or a Heidegger, or to some extent, right? Like the world exists, even with the regularity, right?
Even Heisenberg. Like I said, there was some overlap. I mean, Heisenberg fully admitted that this scientific method is not going to explain the universe. Can't possibly do it.
We try to make that, though. Heidegger,
you can get these small. It was like pre-Wigner. I mean, you can get small subsystems where you can get a system to work, but you go outside of that and it all falls apart because the world isn't explicable that way.
But even there, I felt like you can understand these things on the intellectual level, right? But in some sense, you do have to kind of experience, right?
Well, it all comes down to experience.
You have to experience this in a way. It defies language, right? The language has to kind of like reflect or whatever it is. I know it sounds like this,
the real mystery is unsayable. All you can say is what is disclosed, and then you got the shimmering around it, which is unsayable, and it's there that you run into the problem of metaphysics, and you see that in physics when you have people like Sean Carroll going on about multi-worlds. You may as well be talking about how many angels fit on the head of a pin. It's pure, ungrounded metaphysics trying to explain what simply can't be grasped.
But we It's what grounds what we claim to grasp. It provides
The
the meaning for what, in the same way that, you know, you only understand the object of a hammer with its properties on the basis of what you use it for, of the equipmentality. So that equipmentality, that use, or that in order to, sits there in the background. It is implied by the object, but we can explicitly not be aware of it, even though it is absolutely necessary. It is implied in the meaning of the object for us. By the same token, what you're describing here in terms of the ineffability, that which we can't, we can only show, we can't say, that this mystery, that is implied, that's built into our understanding of our everyday
absolutely,
objects. It's already
yes,
there in the
always there.
everyday objects. The everyday objects wouldn't exist for us if it weren't for that, whatever you're describing in terms of these ineffable qualities. They're not
Exactly.
separate from it. It's not they're not outside of our everyday objects. They are our everyday objects.
No,
It's not a question of
our
having to.
everyday
Yeah.
objects are a reduction of what that is. That is always there before anything else. There is that unknowable closedness, that the concealedness. It thrusts up partly a little bit that you can see, and that becomes the thing. And around that thing is the shimmering that is the mystery of all that's still concealed. But
Why is it around that thing? Why isn't it the thing? Is well, in what sense is
it
it
might be
around it?
glowing right in the middle of it.
Well, you see,
There in Chicago at the Art Institute, there was an amazing thing. There was not intentionally, but there was a Van Gogh painting it was an outdoor painting, and the sun was out, and there was a glass of wine, and next to it was a Manet painting, not Monet, but Manet, of people sitting outside, and there was a glass of wine. And the difference was, it was the Manet. I mean, I love Manet, but he's not Van Gogh. You could see that there was the light kind of shining off of the wine, and they were two different things. Whereas on the Van Gogh, it was a glow from within, and it was that union of the sun and the wine, which was a much deeper sort of picture into that world than the Manet was.
You could say roughly. I know it's one of those things where like the shimmering is being itself, which is not a being, but which I guess
is being itself. In its,
so in some sense, it's more noble than any being that can emerge into it, right?
Exactly. It is the beckoning of the mystery, and that's where Wittgenstein and Heidegger do kind of come together, because they both see that mystery, the beckoning of the mystery that we could never say.
It shows itself, right?
And it shows itself, and it beckons you. And for Wittgenstein, all you can do is point at it. For Heidegger, you can sing it in poetry.
I think, oh my gosh, I think the way he says about equivalentality, actually, it's just perfect. I think he actually understood art. Come from totally personal perspective. I think the way to think about equivalentality and how you appreciate from the surface of the work of art. Have you ever heard of Monsieur Duchamp's The Fountain? So
of course,
you male urinate? Have you peed in one? Of course, you use it in daily basis. But Monsieur Duchamp, like one time he decided to troll everybody, so he used this male urine, and he kind of like.
Yeah. And he called it our mud.
He called it, yeah, and he just, because he wants to troll everybody. But the thing is, I think that's a perfect example for equivalentality, because equivalentality in this case would be you appreciate this urine as art, but the equivalentality would be you only see it as urine. But in the context of the setting later, in the same passage, he talks about from equivalentality to aletheia. Aletheia would be the reveal of the truth. And in this context, the urine transferred and transcended in a museum and exhibition setting. And then it became the subversive, and the subversiveness of this urine, it just transcended. And the aletheia that which the urine revealed would be the truth, and the truth would be what Monsieur Duchamp wanted you to see, which is what the urine symbol actually want to represent. Every
Well, I
if
would
you don't
disagree
really,
with I directionally, I think you're right. I would have some
Mhm.
disagreements with that, because we're not talking about representation at all. Let's get rid of that concept completely. What he did do is take it out of its context, its everyday commonality, and showed it. But the urinal isn't the work of art. The working of the art is art experiencing it in its strangeness, not in its
Right.
everydayness.
Thank you.
Right. Right. So you talked about you described in terms of the beckoning. Would you agree that if you just leave it with the beckoning, then there's a danger of attaching the beckoning to an everyday object, and then the beckoning itself becomes another category. It becomes a larger category. Whereas if you emphasize that it's the beckoning of this absolutely unique, particular, unreplaceable event, it's the uniqueness of it that is not just the generality of the concept of a beckoning that you then place over everyday experiences, right?
Not only could I
Because
not agree more with that, you just put your finger on the difference between authentic experience and metaphysics.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's it's I see it in terms of the notion of difference or difference within identity. The difference within identity. Uh, um, you know, we well, whether we're talking about, say, this same object. Oh, I see this object. Now I continue to see this object, or
Yeah.
um, my moving from this object to another object. In both cases, um, we're starting from the assumption of an identity, this object or that object, and then
Right.
whereas if you start from different, Heidegger says, we don't. That's what we forget, right? And then we try to import it later as a secondary thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
As a
I
kind of a
agree.
glue, right? Right. We have our
Yes.
identities, and then we use it as a glue, as a connector, the is or the differentiator. Okay, now and when you tell that to a lot of people, and you say, well, if you start with difference rather than the identities, they'll say, well, how can you have a difference without having something that differs? Don't you have to start with the things and then proceed to talk about relations or differences or oppositions, right?
Right.
And that's a very,
And
very
to do
difficult.
that, and that's why I said you put your finger on the difference between authentic and metaphysics, because what metaphysics does is it takes that shimmering and it sets it off into a never land that you can't access, and it's not physical, it's behind the physical, and then you can make it anything you want it to be. And in doing that, you all the things that are unique no longer are unique, because the
Yeah,
being has been taken out of it, and now you just have objects, interchangeable objects. That's what Heidegger talks about in a later thing, identity and difference, where
yeah,
A is A descends, it reduces to A equals A, and the inevitable destiny of that move, which starts with Socrates, is Gestell, where everything becomes stored reserve, Bestand.
mhm, yeah.
Well, we've talked this through quite a bit. Does anybody else have anything else to add, or
Oh, Jeff,
this?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Later in this essay, after the part about Van Gogh, and he talked about Hodenheim, and then at some point he cited this poem by C.F. Meyer, Roman Fountain. I
Mhm.
don't get it. I don't understand why is it there.
Yeah, that's a real good question.
Let me look at
What he
that.
was talking about is art is not mimetic. Remember, that goes back to Aristotle, and art is the imitation of nature. Um, and he said, but that's not, Heidegger is saying that's not what art is, but he says it can do that and still be art. And that the Roman Fountain is a very mimetic sort of poem. If you read it superficially, maybe next time we should go into that poem and Hölderlin's poem on the Rhine, because what the poem really does, if you enter into it and don't just think you understand it as a mimetic piece of a fountain, is it brings about the Roman world in more profound ways. That's another conversation, though.
That's interesting what you just said. And now that I think about it, that makes a lot of sense. So for Aristotle and presumably for Plato, art is twice removed from the truth, right? Reality, right?
Yes.
It's an imitation of what's real, which is an imperfect copy of, right, this kind of...
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Heidegger's saying it's more in being, right? It's quite the opposite. It's not twice. It actually brings...
Opposite.
Interesting.
Right.
It's a pretty radical
Yes.
departure.
The other thing is, I don't know if it's translation or something, but it's also my personal thing. Every time I see like a line from a poem and it starts with an end, I just want to just scrape the end, just delete it. I hate that. I hate a sentence with
But
end.
on some level, the more I'm thinking about it, the more Heidegger does kind of disclose the being of a being in a more originary, or whatever he calls it, right, primordial way. The essence, right? So he is still operating in that a little bit of that framework.
See, that's what he does. In this one, he does it a little bit more crudely than he does later, because he's trying to stay within the discipline of hermeneutics. But he goes on to actually be a poetic thinker. But there's poetic thinking in this. But in the more mature Heidegger, it's pure poetry.
It's just I think this one, it's his most understandable piece. It's so easy to understand. And I think but also in a way, I think he just illustrated everything perfectly. And also, I think it's also just, I don't know, but I feel like it's also like, it feels like the end of the world, because I feel he's like the only philosopher that also encapsulates everything together. You see, he mentioned like the Mercedes, the Volkswagen, and Aristotle, and all the paintings, the Van Gogh. You just feel like from all the inventions, all the works of art, and the hymns, whatever in history, and all the machines, packed everything in this essay about art, that you feel like it's the end of the world, and then everything after him is like the postmodern, whatever that thing is.
That's a really interesting point.
It's just personal opinion. When I read it, especially when I read the Volkswagen part, I feel like it's like the end of the world.
But Heidegger saw himself as the beginning, just the beginning. He's seminal in the literal meaning of the word. He is the beginning seed. But he was just the beginning. We got to figure out how do we go down the path, and philosophy in general has totally failed in that attempt.
This takes place where you can't totally ignore the context in which the thing was written, 1935.
Right.
Heidegger, by this point, has disabused himself of any illusion that the Nazis are going to usher in a new world, right? So the move
he was still he hadn't totally disillusioned himself to that yet.
He's still kind of thinking he can form. Okay.
That statement about founding of a state is
by some political strongman or whatever.
I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. Just by some wannabe tyrant or whatever, right? Can usher in a new era of being or whatever. Okay.
I think you see in 49 with the history of being, you see a very different Heidegger.
I mean, already in 38 in Ponderings, he talks about how he was deluded and that everything that he thought that the National Socialists were going to usher in, they were into blood and genetics, and
he talks about that in 38, but this is 35, and he wasn't quite there yet.
Okay.
But I just heard the chapter I have to say that poem is really good written. The thinker as poet. It's
Oh,
so good written.
aus
It's not
der
just the translation,
Erfahrung
it's so
denken.
good.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious how come he just in his entire life he just didn't never wrote more poetry. It's a miss. I don't understand.
Well,
But
he did. He just didn't
um,
write it in verse.
you know that line like too late for the gods but too early for the being. It just reads like kind of the end of the world, kind of to the other
Wir
part.
kamen zu früh für die Götter und zu spät für das Sein, dessen angefangenes Gedicht ist der Mensch. The last part of that is whose just begun poem is man. We come too late for the gods and too early for being, whose just begun poem is man. It's my favorite line. I love that.
It's so beautiful.
Yes, it's a poetic way of writing, like a very artistic way of writing, right? Sometimes there's a bit of a performance going on. You start to get kind of familiar with the tactics, right? Leading you one way to kind of like knock it down and the rhetorical stuff. But he's a very good writer, it seems like, even in English translation. Some of the stuff.
Yeah, I feel like it's easy to understand what he's trying to say about his philosophy in this poem than reading other things he wrote later in his life.
Yeah,
that's what I'm talking about, though. For whatever reason, you have the natural disposition, the temperament to really, he resonates with you. On some stuff he does with me, but I still have a bit of, I don't know what it is, natural. I have a bit of the analytic philosopher in me that is hard to totally get rid of. Appreciation for clarity, saying what you mean, saying it straightforwardly. So that's why Wittgenstein, I know he has his own little kind of, egotistical way of presenting things. However, his very straightforward, the sincerity appeals to me.
The difference is Wittgenstein was not a poet, and that's why he thought you could only point. Heidegger was a poet, and he knew you could sing it.
And
I think that's part of it.
The other thing is, okay, so I took the philosophy of aesthetics when I was in school, but very interesting is we never read this book in that class, and which is very interesting. But also the professor, he's a monk that studied, he's a Dominican monk, priest, that studied physics in college. Somehow he got assigned to teach that class of philosophy of aesthetics, which is about what is beauty, what is art. And all he talks about was Kant and a lot of Hegel, and then there are a few kind of like British philosophers about aesthetics, and then he also picked Tolstoy. And I have to say, most of all those books he picked was like kind of bullshit. But after reading all of those books and looking at this, I think Heidegger really has like a really profound and a comprehensive understanding of what is art. He's also very, very fair when it comes to how you examine and look at art. And he also understands both art, poetry. He understands almost everything when it comes to how you should look at art and in his relation with philosophy. I feel like he's so balanced on this topic. But other philosophers, when it comes to art, they either doesn't know enough about art and know too much philosophy, or they are just so, I don't know, incoherent.
There's only one Heidegger. I've said this several times, and I firmly believe this. He and Heisenberg, and they knew each other well, were the two seminal thinkers of the 20th century. They shaped everything. And there's not been another Heidegger since. I don't know if there, great philosophers don't happen every decade. Sometimes they don't even happen in a century. They're very, very rare. Heidegger.
So you prefer Heisenberg to Nietzsche, for example?
No, I just think of Nietzsche as 19th century.
You think of Nietzsche as 19th century. See, I would argue that about Heisenberg. I think Heisenberg's ideas go back to Kant.
Well, he was Kantian. On the other hand, he was thoroughly understood that we have now come up against the noumenal and we can't grasp it in all. He was Kantian to the degree that we can't understand the noumenal, but he was not Kantian in his unassailed belief in the ability of reason. He certainly did. If he ever did think that, he was disabused of that notion by quantum mechanics and its indeterminability.
And he writes much better than Kant. He writes much better than Kant. Oh my god, I feel like really
Kant
incompetent.
was hugely important for his time. We would never have gotten anywhere without the giant step of Kant's epistemology. That was crucial in the destining of Western thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that Heisenberg would be a good cheerleader for Karl Popper's view of the march of history of scientific
I don't
progress.
think so. Heisenberg.
You don't think so?
No. Heisenberg didn't think that you could have systematic overall metaphysical explanations. He did not think that was possible. And you weren't with us on the first one where we talked about Heidegger's question concerning technology and Heisenberg's response to it, which they jointly gave at a conference in Munich in 1953. And it's an amazing essay that Heisenberg wrote. Now he doesn't back away from the Gestalt. He embraces it, but there's a lot of overlap between Heisenberg and Heidegger that, if you dig a little bit, is kind of surprising. Heisenberg flatly denied the ability of systematic, logical explanation of reality. And he did that before Wigner's ELE.
And I don't see how Wigner is the one that the remarkable or the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
One of the most misunderstood essays ever. People, they don't understand. They miss the irony in the inexplicable, the irrational. They miss, and they totally ignore his section on the ELE. I don't know if you've ever been to my blog, but I go into that. Maybe we should do that essay. But I on my blog, I have a response to William Lane Craig in his interpretation of that essay, where I show that it means exactly the opposite of what some people try to make it be, especially if you know the history behind his writing that. Maybe we should do that essay. I mean, it's a critically important essay.
It's
not Heidegger, it's Wigner, but
is that also about physics?
I'm sorry?
Is that also about physics and philosophy?
Yes, it is about physics and philosophy. Wigner had a very philosophical side to him. He was a Nobel-winning physicist with a very, remember I said there were some, 99% are of the temperament where they are in open rebellion against existence. Wigner wasn't one of those.
I feel this is a very interesting thing about the STEM field, that people in the STEM field are kind of like they stop being kind of like fun, they stop being fun. They're not like the old physicists or like chemists. They stop being fun and know much more things that are not STEM. They're just they're like technicians at some point. It feels like
that's what Lee Smolin made that complaint about.
Just, like Heisenberg, he writes.
I'm sorry, Josh. Could you say that again, please?
Lee Smolin made that same argument against the current generation of physicists. He claimed that the generation that included Bohr and Heisenberg, and they were also philosophers, and that with this generation of physicists.
Heisenberg wrote a remarkable book at the end of the 50s, like 59. You should read that book. Smolin is also in that 1%, not the 99%. Absolutely.
Is he like an original thinker, or is he just kind of a Kantian? Not that that's bad or anything, but does he present original philosophical?
Smolin is he's a physicist, but a very original thinker, very much so. Yeah, no, Smolin's one of the good guys.
I think, oh my gosh, this is the idea I always have every time we talk about STEM. I think not just physicists, really, even poets, everybody just needs, like Nietzsche said, like half of you needs to be Apollo. You have Apollo's rationality, and the other half you need to have Dionysus, kind of part of fun. But if you imagine, like, they're all like that, you have that and you just be great.
Yeah.
if you're a scientist. Like
That's part of the problem with perception of
I-
science, right? I know you kind of battled against that.
part.
I'm sorry, Eric. Say it again.
No, I'm saying that's part of the problem. The perception that scientists are kind of drab and boring and they disenchant the world, right? I know like Carl Sagan and people have tried to kind of like make it sexy or something, right? And exciting, and you're made of stardust type thing. But by itself, discovering like even those aspects of the universe seems to be exciting, and it would draw people to
it is, and that's
are not boring, right? Like
I mean, I'm absolutely obsessed with quantum physics. I have been for decades. It's not so much their theories, it's their discoveries and observations, because it's around those that we get the shimmering that only a few like Wigner and Smolin can deal with. But you know, to me, that's the big neon. It's the spotlights that should be beckoning to poets.
Right. I often think about. Go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, isn't the shimmering associated? And this is where I would be kind of a little bit cautious in terms of my attitude towards. Well, I mean, I'm less familiar with Heidegger. I did read that piece of essay that Heisenberg wrote, but beyond that, I'm not all that familiar with his work. But in general, my reluctance towards the bulk of physicists today, and not just physicists, but those that work in many of the sciences, is precisely that they consider the most valuable contribution of science to be associated with evidence. We gather evidence and we discover what appears to be true, and then of course they'll counter and say, well, they'll pat themselves on the back and they'll say the wonderful thing about science is that we never take for granted those truths. We know that they will be falsified, and so we're constantly. But what I find missing there, which to me is a central thing that Heidegger pinpointed, and it has nothing to do with truth versus falsity in terms of correspondence. It has to do with turning the picture on its head, and what you call that when you turn a picture on its head, when you shift from the duck to the rabbit view, or you perform a Gestalt shift. You're not making something that was previously true false. You're changing the subject, and that's where the magic in science or in ideas or in philosophy or in poetry comes from. It is in the changing the sense of the world.
Yes.
If you were going to design an educational system around Heideggerian philosophy, right, you would incorporate the latest discoveries in science, right? You would give each being its own due. I thought about that. How to practically, right, make these things operative in society. I know that's the type of thinking that Heidegger doesn't really like, but on some level, right, you have to think about how would you kind of like use these great insights for larger kind of influence on society to get a transformation from the duck to the rabbit, or not either or, but both. Right, and more aspects are there maybe to be uncovered. It's not science,
but not just aspects within it, but a whole shift in the way that you look at it. Maybe you're not even looking at an object anymore. I mean, I'm talking about a more profound change in, recognizing that you're starting from presuppositions before you get to the point where you have a scientific enterprise that has its apparatuses and its definitions of what constitutes evidence.
In this essay, Heidegger gets to that. Can I say we're just about at the 2-hour mark, and I said we're recording this for the people who couldn't be here today, so it's going to shut off at the 2-hour. But might I suggest this, that we continue next Monday on this topic. Also, I will send out copies of the Wigner essay, and we take a look at that. We all okay with that?
Yeah. Wait, I was gonna suggest I was thinking if we can do the poetry one next time, and then we do the physics one next time. What do you think?
What what are poets for?
The essay?
The Vozu Dichter?
Yeah.
What are poets for? You want to do that one?
Yeah.
Do we have a preference, guys?
Because I feel like we have to discuss poetry's relationship with Heidegger, and then we go for something.
We'll do what are poets for next. I will send out the Wigner essay though. Let's take a look at it.
Where's that from? Oh, okay. Okay, I got it here. What are poets for? Yeah, I read that. Okay, that would be good.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. I really appreciate you guys coming on for this. I mean, every one of you just contributes so great to this conversation. And that's I just really
Well,
appreciate it. Thank you
We're all
guys.
Heidegger junkies,
So
apparently.
Jeff,
Yeah, we are.
this is kind of my field. Physics is really kind of like not my thing. You know, I only know things like I only know gravity and molecules and probably atoms a little bit. Yeah, gosh.
All right. We'll see you guys later. Thanks.
Okay.